Hey there, my name is David Rogers, and I want to welcome you to the Nashville Jazz Workshop's Artist Spotlight, where every month I get the chance to sit down with a handful of artists with upcoming performances at the legendary Jazz Cave in Nashville, Tennessee. We get to dive into a bit of jazz history while also learning about each artist's process of preparing for their upcoming show. This week, I sat down with pianist, singer, composer, and arranger Chris Walters ahead of his May 3rd George Gershwin and Cole Porter tribute show. We chatted about Chris's love for singing and storytelling. Chris shared his thoughts on what makes Cole Porter such a great composer, which Gershwin arrangement he's most looking forward to, and he also told us the story of the first time he ever played Rhapsody in Blue. I hope you enjoy. Hey, Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, David, thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely,
I'm looking forward
man.
to this.
Yes. So you're here to talk about Rhapsody in Burlesque, which is a tribute to Cole Porter and George Gershwin.
That's right, the music of those two great American composers.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think it's a burlesque show, which I'm not opposed to. I'm not opposed to, but, honestly, it was my daughter. I was like trying to come up with a name for the show, the music of George Gershwin and Cole Porter, which is exciting enough, but my daughter decided, why don't you call it Rhapsody in Burlesque? She actually called this medley of their works that I perform in the show. Mm-hmm. I start with the part of the first movement from Gershwin's Concerto in F, go into Here Come to Honeyman from Porgy and Bess. But in this case, the Honeyman is not an actual honey seller, it's a pimp.
Okay.
And then I go into Cole Porter's Love for Sale, and I sing it more
nice.
as the pimp than as a prostitute. We're getting into heavy, dark stuff already.
1 minute in.
So
Here
that's
we go.
I didn't write the material.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not singing anything that's not in the shows. But I'd written that, and she goes, why don't you call that Rhapsody in Burlesque? So that medley started out as Rhapsody in Burlesque, and now I call the whole show Rhapsody in Burlesque.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm wondering, what about these two composers prompted you to craft the show around their music? Like, what about Gershwin? Well, Gershwin, by the way, for those who don't know, he's so wide and deep.
Absolutely.
Classical music, the jazz, the songs.
Absolutely. It's and it feels like he was a self-made composer in a lot of ways. His musical vocabulary is so recognizable, He came about in late teens and early 20s as the jazz age was getting started, and that's obviously really informed where he was coming from. But he's also of Jewish immigrant parents, so he's coming from another cultural experience too. And all that stuff in the melting pot of the early 20th century, I think informs his music. He was a Tin Pan Alley songwriter during the late teens and early 20s, and then was taken seriously as that, but not, he was like a piano plugger. He would plug the tunes of the day, but he wasn't taken seriously as a composer, even after the Paul Whiteman Orchestra performed Rhapsody in Blue with him, which shocked audiences because of its creativity. He was panned by certain classical critics because it wasn't actually a piano concerto. It didn't fit within the structures necessarily of classical forms, and it was basically in 8 and 16 bar form, so it was more popular music and not thought of in the terms of like the classical composers of the day, Prokofiev and so forth.
Yeah.
One reason I got into Gershwin in general is when I was in high school and I was playing in the jazz band and I was studying classical piano. I still thought I might be a classical concertizing pianist. That was what I was thinking. I'm sure you went through that as well with your upbringing and your training.
Yeah, all that repertoire.
Exactly.
It's all kind of aimed towards the concert stage.
Exactly. But of course, I got into jazz, and then the band instructor there when I was a junior said he wanted to get me out of his hair. So he said, why don't you learn Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue? And so I went home, and I mean, you can ask my family. I practiced that. I butchered their ears practicing that thing every day. And finally, he said, if you learn it, maybe we'll put it on the spring concert with the concert band.
Wow.
And so I did learn it. I brought it to my instructor, and we got through it together, and I eventually learned it. And I played it for my band instructor, and he said, well, I didn't expect you to learn it. Now we're going to put it on the band program. And I have a cassette recording of that band program where we performed it. And it's unlistenable. I mean, not just the band, I mean me too. I'm taking tempos way too fast or way too slow. Or I'm pretty clean with, for 17-year-old or whatever, but I took the opportunity, before I went to college, after I graduated from high school, I took the opportunity to audition for the Chattanooga Symphony Orchestra's Gershwin competition, and I came in 5th place out of like 29 contestants, so I didn't get in the top 3, but I had a little bit of success
Yeah.
and momentum going. So that was kind of started my love of Gershwin. I had learned the concerto or moments from the Concerto in F. I knew Rhapsody in Blue. I knew the Preludes. I knew stuff from Porgy and Bess. So at the time, I was really enamored with a St. Louis Symphony recording with Jeffrey Siegel as the pianist. They did a bunch of orchestral and piano and orchestral works that he was the pianist on. And that was my first foray into listening and loving that music. And then eventually, as we all did, I started listening to different recordings and garnering other stuff from other places, and getting involved in other music other than classical and early 20th century jazz-influenced numbers. With Cole Porter, when I first heard his music, I was just enamored with the marriage of melody and lyrics. I think, for my tastes, I really think he's one of the great composers in terms of marrying the lyric with melody. Yeah, a lot of it's cheeky. It's very dated in a lot of ways, that late 20s, early 30s American songbook, Broadway show mentality. A lot of it is that. But if you take it out of that venue and just listen to it from a melodic and serious lyrical standpoint, it's undeniable. It's just, I love it. It's beautiful. It's amazing stuff. It's really high art.
Yeah. I want to ask you about Rhapsody in Blue, because if I'm not mistaken, you have a trio version of that. Did I see that in the promo materials?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about your arrangement.
Well, it's so recognizable. Everybody has heard some of the themes. Obviously, what was it? Was it United Airlines that had the ending of the piece? So that's ubiquitous. And some of those little cadenzas that piano takes are so recognizable. They have the hammer-on sound. That kind. They're just very idiomatic of 1930s, the Chrysler Building being built and stuff. It's got that whole thing. So the process really is just with the trio is really playing the piece fairly properly, but getting into pockets with the trio, like grooves and stuff, instead of making it just orchestral. And it's also giving certain moments, let's say, to the bass player that would normally be played by a trombone or a French horn or something, giving him a melody, and it just feels, and it's got a more boppish feel than the classical interpretation of it.
Was there a particular arrangement or song that you remember, this one was like particularly exciting to work on, or one you have fun with everything, but was there one, I saw you smile, so is there one that comes to mind?
George Gershwin's Cuban Overture. I do a medley. It's a medley. I start with his Lullaby for String Orchestra.
Okay.
And then I go into the Cuban Overture. And there's something, again, that joy that Gershwin brings to his music, but it feels, even though it's Cuban Overture, there's Cuban rhythms and Afro-Cuban stuff going in there, it still feels like New York. There's Cuban influences in New York as it is. It's a melting pot.
Yeah.
So, and that's all, but you still hear the bustle of the city and see the high-rise buildings. You know what I mean? Even with that melody, So, and that was one I always wanted to tackle. That was one I didn't know that well. So I sat with the score for a while. I knew it well from listening to it, but not performing it. So that's one that I kind of
interesting.
figured out.
So that process was, so you obviously listened to it a bunch, and you actually sat down with the score.
Yes.
And kind of deconstructed the
exactly
the harmonies.
Happened.
And what are some of the takeaways harmonically from Gershwin that feel like this is what makes Gershwin, or what are some sounds or textures that you think like this is New York City, or for the music nerds among us?
I think it's the chromaticisms. Like he does these contrary motion things where he's going, the bass is going chromatically down, and then the chords are going chromatically up. I feel like Stravinsky did that with the Tristan and Isolde opening theme, the love theme from that. I'm always fascinated with that because playing through that, even though it's not swinging, it's Bill Evans to me. It's jazz. You know what I mean? With the flat fifth chords and those chord substitutions. That's where all the boppers learned this stuff, was from Stravinsky, So as far as harmonically.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I get out of Gershwin is this density of the harmonies. And a lot of times I was talking with a composer about this last year and I never thought of it this way. But with Rhapsody in Blue especially, I think by the time he was writing the concerto and Porgy and Bess, his transitions going from one moment to another became much more, they resonated more. But if you really get into Rhapsody in Blue, you notice his themes are amazing. But getting from one to the other, he does these, I wouldn't say trite, he just does things that don't necessarily have a place. They're just like, okay, here comes a transition.
Yeah.
Kind of. Does that make sense?
It does,
And,
yeah.
But he grew out of that. But that was probably his first foray into that. And as you're playing, that sounds like Gershwin to me. These chromaticisms that have no place.
Yeah.
And then they explode into this beautiful theme that's like totally Gershwin.
Yeah.
You know? So
that's great. I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about. And I think of different little moments, even in Rhapsody in Blue, like da 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 da.
Exactly.
Da, 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 the sequence of thirds or whatever that might be.
Exactly. Yeah.
What has your experience been like in preparing to sing these songs by George Gershwin and Cole Porter? I don't know anything hardly about singing, but you have
Neither do I.
Boy, I teed that one up, didn't I?
Yeah.
But people should check out your records. You have
thanks.
many records out there, and you're singing on all of them, right?
Yeah.
When you were in your first kind of foray into Gershwin and Rhapsody in Blue, were you thinking about singing when you were 17 or when you were,
No.
When did that come into your musical vocabulary?
Really, it was in the late 90s, early 2000s
Okay.
when I started seriously writing songwriting.
Yeah.
Writing songs. I was working with some great songwriters. And I just started demoing my songs, hoping that someone would want to cut them.
Yeah.
And people said, why don't you just go in and cut these songs yourself? You sound great, which is not true at all. But I will say, I feel like as musicians always do, I've developed a thing
Definitely.
with my voice because I find my way around songs. And I've learned from the great songwriters, which there are a bunch here in Nashville, for one. And there's a thing as a musician about performing something as if it's the first time you're performing, even though you know it deeply. You played it a million times. You perform it each time as if it's the first time it's being heard, as if it's the first time it's being put out into the world or whatever. And there's a thing that I'm able to do often, not always, where I find my way inside of the song to where I'm telling the story exactly like I want to tell it.
Wow.
And yes, I've worked on my pitch and I've worked on my breath strength and I've worked on all the things, but really it's more a matter for me of telling a story. And because I wouldn't say I'm that complicated of an individual, but I have my dark thoughts. And I think there's a beauty in speaking of really, really beautiful lyrics and even happier love songs, but coming out of the darkness that you're singing it with into the light. That's a lot deeper than I meant that answer to be.
No,
But
that's right.
that's kind of how I approach songs.
Yeah.
Singing, I guess.
Is there a certain song, either of Gershwin's or Porter's, that comes to mind when you think about a story that feels most compelling?
Yeah, Love for Sale.
Love for Sale.
Cole Porter.
Yeah.
Love for Sale. I mean, I actually really like his Every Time We Say Goodbye as well. But Love for Sale, especially the bridge. I mean, that's a dark song. That's not a happy love song. But the bridge is so extraordinary. Everything about it, the harmonies, the melody, and especially the lyric.
Yeah, what's that lyric?
Let the poets pipe of love in their childish way. I know every type of love better far than they. If you want the thrill of love, I've been through the mill of love. Old love, new love, every love but true love, love for sale. It's heavy stuff, man. But it's beautiful. I mean, in its own...
Amazingly crafted.
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly. That's one that really speaks to me. And again, I have a stronger affinity with Cole Porter's lyrics than, say, Ira Gershwin's or DuBose Hayward. DuBose Hayward wrote the Porgy and Bess libretto, so those are his lyrics for those songs. But usually the Gershwin songs are done with George's brother, Ira. Although they're great songs, they're not always the ones that really grab my attention like Cole Porter's do,
Well, we're in for a treat this Friday, May 3rd.
Yes.
7:30 at
I
the
am
workshop.
so looking forward to it, and so are the guys in the band.
Yeah, so tell me about who's joining you.
Okay, so Zeb Briskovich on bass and Miles Vanderveer on drums. They're both from Illinois. They teach at SIU Edwardsville, and they're extraordinary musicians. I've worked with them on and off for about 12 years now. A lot of times with the Peter Mayer group, but also in different situations. One reason I have them for this is because I want them for it, but also it was like when the person was hiring me for this, they wanted Zeb and Miles because they knew we worked together. So it was kind of like a good deal where it's like they love the way we work together as a trio. So they were like, why don't you bring them down and make it happen? And of course, they were compelling and they were kind enough to join me on this. So, yeah.
Well, that's good news for us in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, thanks so much, man. I'm really looking forward to Friday.
Thank you, David. I am too. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.